My husband tossed the divorce papers onto our glass coffee table with a smirk that made my blood run cold. I want the house, the cars, and the business, he declared, not even looking up from his phone. You keep the kid. I do not have time for school drop-offs while I build my empire. My lawyer practically begged me to fight him for every penny. Instead, I looked my husband dead in the eye and said, "Fine, take it all." He thought he had broken me. He thought he won the ultimate jackpot. But what he did not know was that by demanding everything, he was walking straight into a trap that would cost him his entire life. My name is Audrey. I am 34 years old, and up until that moment, I thought I was building a beautiful life for my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic partner who thought they could walk all over you. Trust me, you will want to hear how this ended. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my reality shattered. I had just returned home from a grueling 3-day business trip in Chicago. As a regional director for a major logistics company, my schedule was often punishing, but I pushed through the exhaustion because I wanted to provide a solid foundation for my family. I turned my key in the lock of our heavy wooden front door, my shoulders aching under the weight of my laptop bag. I expected to find a quiet, empty house. Instead, the jarring scent of cheap vanilla perfume hit me the second I stepped into the foyer. I kicked off my heels and walked down the hallway, the cool hardwood floors beneath my feet doing nothing to ground the sudden panic rising in my chest. I walked into the living room and time seemed to freeze. There in the center of our sunlit living room was my husband, Brad. He was 35 years old, wearing a crisp, tailored shirt and casually packing his expensive designer suitcase. And sitting right there on my custom emerald green velvet sofa was a girl who looked no older than 24. I would later learn her name was Brittany. She was scrolling through her phone, looking completely unbothered, and sipping tea out of a crooked hand-painted ceramic mug. It was the mug my 5-year-old daughter Lily had made for me for Mother's Day. Brad did not jump when he saw me. He did not look guilty or ashamed. He simply zipped his suitcase, walked over to the glass coffee table, and dropped a thick stack of legal documents right in the center. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. He looked at me with a cold, hollow expression, his jaw set in a line of pure arrogance. "I am filing for divorce, Audrey," he said, his voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "I am moving on." I stood there by the doorway, my brain struggling to process the scene unfolding in front of me. The overwhelming smell of the vanilla perfume, the stranger sitting comfortably on my furniture, the legal papers mocking me from the table. Before I could even formulate a question, before I could ask how long this had been going on, or why he was doing this, Brad started listing his demands. He spoke rapidly, like he was placing an order at a restaurant. "I want the house," he declared, crossing his arms and leaning back on his heels. "I want both of the SUVs, and I am maintaining 100% control and ownership of my e-commerce business. You are not touching a single dime of my company." I stared at him, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of his words. The house we were standing in was a beautiful $1.2 million suburban property. I had paid the entire down payment myself, draining my savings and using 3 years of my corporate bonuses. His so-called e-commerce business was nothing more than a glorified online storefront that barely broke even most months. Yet Brad paraded around town calling himself a self-made CEO. He spent more time buying expensive watches, attending lavish networking brunches, and leasing luxury cars to look wealthy on social media than he did actually working. And now he was standing in the very living room I had paid to furnish, demanding I hand over every single thing I had broken my back to build. "You have been holding back my empire for years, Audrey." Brad continued, pacing the room with a swagger that made me physically nauseous. "You just do not understand the mindset of a high-value entrepreneur. You are just a corporate drone. I need someone who matches my energy, someone who actually supports my vision and respects my grind." He gestured openly toward Brittany. She finally looked up from her glowing phone screen and gave me a pitiful, condescending little smile as if she actually felt sorry for me. I felt my stomach turn violently. This man who had comfortably lived off my stable, demanding career while he played the role of a business mogul was actually standing here trying to discard me like an old appliance. He honestly believed his own delusions of grandeur. He thought he was the prize, and he wanted me to walk away with nothing, stripped of my home and the assets I had funded. The shock was slowly fading, replaced by a deep, terrifying clarity. I did not scream, and I did not cry. I just watched him realizing for the first time who I had really married. I looked from the thick stack of papers on the glass table back to his face. For 7 years I had made excuses for him. When he forgot our anniversaries because he was too busy networking, I forgave him. When he drained our vacation fund to invest in another one of his dead-end business schemes, I worked overtime to rebuild our savings. I had been the safety net that allowed him to play pretend. And this was my reward: being lectured about my lack of vision by a man who could not even remember to pay the electric bill on time. "You want the house?" I repeated slowly, testing the weight of the words. My voice was dangerously calm, so quiet that Brittany stopped scrolling and looked over at me. "You want the house, both cars, and your business." Everything. Brad snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden vicious anger. "I am not negotiating with you, Audrey. My lawyers are sharks. If you try to drag this out, if you try to take half of what is mine, I promise you, I will bury you in legal fees until you are living out of a cardboard box. I built this lifestyle and I am taking it with me." He walked over to Brittany, taking her hand and pulling her up from my sofa. She left my daughter's mug sitting on the edge of the coffee table, perilously close to the edge. They walked toward the front door, stepping around me, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle in their path. "I am taking Brittany to a hotel for the week," Brad threw over his shoulder. "I suggest you use that time to pack your things and find an apartment. Sign the papers, Audrey. Do not make this harder than it has to be." The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, leaving me standing alone in the suffocating silence of my own home. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the mug, my hands finally beginning to shake. I looked down at the divorce papers. He wanted to take it all. He wanted to leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back. But as I stood there staring at the glossy cover page of his legal demands, a strange, cold sense of calm washed over me. Brad thought he had everything figured out. He thought his intimidation tactics would make me fold and walk away in tears. But he had fundamentally underestimated the woman he married. He wanted my assets, but he was too arrogant to look beneath the surface of his own crumbling empire. I set the mug down safely. I was not going to cry over a man who had already dug his own grave. I forced my voice to remain perfectly steady as I looked at the man I had spent the last 7 years of my life with. The papers on the table demanded my house, my cars, and my money. But there was one glaring omission. And what about Lily? I asked, the silence in the room suddenly feeling heavy enough to crush bone. I watched his face closely, waiting for a flicker of hesitation, a flash of paternal guilt, anything that proved he still had a soul. Instead, Brad let out a short, dismissive scoff. He rolled his eyes like I had just reminded him of a tedious chore he had been trying to avoid. He adjusted his cuffs, refusing to even meet my gaze. "I do not have time for school drop-offs, Audrey," he stated flatly. "I am entering a critical growth phase in my life. I am building a brand, a legacy. I cannot be tied down by kindergarten schedules, weekend playdates, and ballet recitals. It does not fit my trajectory right now. You wanted to be a mother so badly, so you keep the kid. I will keep the assets. We both get what we want." The sheer cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. He was talking about our 5-year-old daughter, a little girl who waited by the front window every evening for him to come home, as if she were a bad investment he was writing off his taxes. He was completely discarding her just so he could play the role of a bachelor millionaire with his new girlfriend. I looked over at Brittany, expecting at least a shred of human decency or shock from her. But she just sat there examining her freshly manicured nails, looking incredibly bored by the fact that the man beside her was abandoning his own child. My grief instantly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, calculating anger. If he wanted to treat our marriage and our family like a business transaction, then I was more than ready to look at the ledger. My eyes drifted down to his wrist. Glinting in the afternoon sunlight was a solid gold $15,000 Rolex watch. I had bought him that exact watch for our 5th wedding anniversary. I had worked 80-hour weeks during the holiday shipping season, securing a massive regional contract for my logistics firm just to earn the bonus that paid for it. He had cried when he opened the box, promising me he would build a future worthy of my support. Now he was wearing that very watch while trying to leave me homeless. Without saying another word, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My thumb quickly tapped the screen, opening our joint banking application. For the past month, I had been so buried in quarterly reports and out-of-state travel that I had not scrutinized our daily expenses. I always trusted Brad to handle the household operating account while I dumped my salary into it. The screen loaded, and the bright, bold numbers stared back at me. I felt a sudden icy drop in the pit of my stomach. The account, which had held over $60,000 just a month ago, was practically decimated. Exactly $40,000 had been systematically drained over the last 3 weeks. I scrolled down the list of transactions, my heart pounding a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs. There were multiple massive withdrawals: $7,000 at a high-end jewelry boutique downtown, $4,000 at an exclusive rooftop restaurant, $8,000 paid to a luxury travel agency, $12,000 transferred directly into the operating account of his failing e-commerce business. I looked up from my phone. Brittany shifted on the velvet sofa, and that is when I noticed the diamond tennis bracelet sparkling on her wrist. It was brand new. My hard-earned money, the funds I had saved for our daughter's college tuition, and our emergency reserves, was currently sitting on the wrist of a 24-year-old stranger in my living room. I walked forward, closing the distance between us. I held the phone up, shoving the glowing screen directly into his face. "What is this, Brad?" I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. $40,000 gone in 21 days. You drained our joint savings to buy jewelry and fund a hotel stay with your mistress while I was in Chicago, securing the contract that pays our mortgage. I expected him to stammer, to deny it, or to at least look caught. I expected the typical panic of a liar exposed. But Brad did not even blink. He actually smiled, a slow, condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. He gently pushed my hand away, completely unbothered by the fact that I had just caught him stealing from his own family. "You are so dramatic, Audrey," he sighed, shaking his head as if he were dealing with an unreasonable child. "That money was not stolen. It was reallocated. I am the CEO of a growing company. I have to project a certain image to attract high-net-worth investors. I cannot be seen driving a sensible sedan and wearing off-the-rack suits while I am trying to close deals. Those were necessary business expenses to upgrade my lifestyle and align with my new brand identity." I stared at him, genuinely astonished by the magnitude of his delusion. "You bought a diamond bracelet for a girl who is barely out of college," I shot back, pointing directly at Brittany. "How exactly does that attract investors, Brad? You are not a CEO. You run an online drop-shipping store out of our guest bedroom. You used my salary to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle because your own business cannot even cover its hosting fees." Brad's face instantly darkened. I had struck the one nerve he could not protect: his fragile, unearned ego. The smugness vanished, replaced by a toxic, simmering rage. He took a step toward me, his jaw clenching so hard I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. "You have always been jealous of my potential," he hissed, his voice dropping an octave. "You have always tried to keep me small, just because you are perfectly happy being a corporate slave. I took that money because I am entitled to it. I endured years of your nagging and your lack of vision. That $40,000 is just a down payment on what you owe me for holding me back." He was entirely serious. He had completely rewritten our history in his mind. In his twisted version of reality, my long hours and financial support were not acts of love, they were a prison that kept him from achieving greatness. He believed that stealing my savings was his rightful compensation. He stood there puffing out his chest in his tailored suit, wearing the watch I bought him, standing in the house I paid for, genuinely believing he was the victim of our marriage. I realized in that exact moment that arguing with him was completely pointless. You cannot reason with a narcissist who has convinced himself that his lies are the absolute truth. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to throw his suitcase across the room and break down sobbing so he could point at me and tell Brittany how crazy and unstable I was. But I refused to play the role he had written for me. I slowly lowered my phone and locked the screen, slipping it back into my pocket. I took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of my blazer, and looked at him with nothing but pure, unfiltered pity. It was the absolute worst reaction I could have given him. My pity enraged him. For a man whose entire identity was built on projecting superiority, looking at him like he was a pathetic lost child was the ultimate insult. The smug confidence vanished from his face, replaced by a dark, ugly hostility. He took another step forward, closing the distance until he was towering over me. I could smell the sharp metallic scent of his expensive cologne, the bottle I had bought for him last Christmas. He leaned in so close that I could see the tiny pulse beating angrily at his temple. "If you think you can play games with me, Audrey, you are making a massive mistake," he whispered, his voice dripping with absolute malice. He raised a finger, pointing it directly at my face. "I am not some middle management drone you can negotiate with. I have retained the most aggressive, high-powered divorce attorneys in the state. If you try to fight me for a single dime of those assets, if you even think about contesting this settlement, they will drag your name through the mud so thoroughly you will never work in this city again." I stood my ground, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I did not break eye contact. He was trying to intimidate me, trying to use the sheer force of his anger to make me fold. "I will bankrupt you with legal fees." He continued, his tone cold and measured. "I will tie you up in court for years. I will subpoena your company, your colleagues, your friends. By the time my lawyers are done with you, that logistics firm you love so much will fire you just to avoid the bad PR. You will be buried in debt and completely unemployable." He paused, letting the weight of his threats hang in the air between us. But then a cruel, mocking smile curled the corners of his mouth. "And if you still refuse to sign over what is rightfully mine," he added softly, "I will take Lily." The air rushed out of my lungs. For a split second, the polished armor I had built around myself cracked. My breath hitched and my fingers twitched at my sides. "I do not even want full custody," Brad sneered, seeing the flicker of genuine terror in my eyes. "But I will fight for it anyway. I will claim you are an unfit mother. I will claim your travel schedule is detrimental to her development. I will hire experts to testify that you are emotionally neglectful. And when I win, I will hand her off to a rotation of cheap nannies while I travel the world with Brittany. You will be lucky if I let you see her every other Christmas. I will do it just to watch you break Audrey. Do not test me." The sheer depravity of his threat echoed in the quiet living room. He was willing to weaponize our innocent 5-year-old daughter, willing to traumatize her and rip her away from the only parent who actually raised her, all to protect his fragile ego and secure his stolen wealth. He was standing there threatening to destroy my entire universe just out of spite. He wanted me to fall to my knees. He wanted me to beg. But as the initial wave of maternal panic washed over me, a strange, profound clarity followed in its wake. My gaze remained fixed on his face, but my peripheral vision caught a detail that changed the entire trajectory of my life. Resting on the velvet armchair just behind him was his open leather briefcase. It was a beautiful, handcrafted Italian leather piece he had insisted on buying to look professional at his networking events. The zipper was undone, and the contents were haphazardly spilling out. Amidst the scattered business cards and glossy promotional brochures, a thick white envelope protruded from the main compartment. It was facing directly toward me. My eyes briefly flicked down to the envelope. The return address was printed in stark, unmistakable black ink. Department of the Treasury, Internal Revenue Service. But it was the stamp across the center that made my heart skip a beat. Printed in bold, aggressive red lettering were the words "Final Notice Intent to Levy." In the span of 2 seconds, 1,000 fragmented puzzle pieces snapped perfectly together in my mind. The missing $40,000 from our joint account. The sudden desperate demand for absolute ownership of the house and the business. The frantic need to secure every single asset under his sole name, without my interference. Brad was not building an empire. Brad was drowning. He had not drained our account just to buy a diamond bracelet for Brittany. He had drained it because his business was completely insolvent. He was hiding a massive financial catastrophe. The IRS did not send a final notice of intent to levy over a few missed tax returns. They sent that notice when a taxpayer was ignoring massive catastrophic debt, and the federal government was preparing to seize bank accounts, garnish wages, and seize physical property. If Brad took sole ownership of the LLC, he took sole ownership of its tax liabilities. If he demanded the house, he was likely planning to use it as collateral, or perhaps he already had. By trying to rob me blind, he was actually constructing a perfect, inescapable financial prison for himself, and he wanted me to hand him the keys. If I fought him in court, the forensic accounting process would eventually uncover his debt. Because we were legally married, I could be held partially responsible for the financial ruin he had secretly orchestrated. I could be tethered to his tax fraud. By threatening me, by trying to scare me away from the assets, he was unwittingly offering me a golden ticket to walk away completely clean. He was handing me the detonator to his own destruction. Brad was still staring at me, his chest heaving slightly, waiting for my reaction. He expected tears. He expected a desperate plea for mercy. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I let my shoulders slump forward, just a fraction of an inch, physically mimicking the posture of a woman who had finally been beaten into submission. I let the fire die out of my eyes, replacing it with a look of hollow, exhausted defeat. "You win," I whispered, my voice intentionally trembling just enough to sound authentic. Brad's cruel smile widened into a full, victorious grin. He practically vibrated with smug satisfaction. "I will not fight you." I continued, looking down at the floor as if I could no longer bear to look at him. "If you want the house, the cars, and the business, you can have them. I just want Lily. That is my only condition. You sign away your parental rights, and I will walk away from the assets. You can have your empire, Brad." He let out a short, triumphant laugh, adjusting his suit jacket. "I told you, Audrey. You should have just listened to me from the beginning. It would have saved us both a lot of time. I will have my lawyers draft the final settlement by Friday. Pack your things." I nodded silently, keeping my eyes fixed on the glossy hardwood floor. He turned around, grabbed his suitcase, and walked toward the front door without another word. I heard the lock click shut behind him. I stood alone in the quiet house, staring at the empty space where he had just been standing. He thought he had crushed me. He thought he had won the ultimate game. But as I pulled my phone back out of my pocket and dialed my lawyer's number, a genuine, terrifying smile spread across my face. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, every single piece of it. 3 days later, I found myself sitting on a cold, folding metal chair in the middle of a crowded elementary school gymnasium. It was the afternoon of Lily and her kindergarten class's annual spring recital. The room smelled like floor wax, stale coffee, and the nervous energy of 100 parents holding up their smartphones. Up on the stage, construction paper flowers were taped to the walls, and the music teacher was trying to wrangle 25-year-olds dressed as bumblebees and ladybugs into a straight line. Under normal circumstances, this would be a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. I had left the office 3 hours early, ignoring a mountain of urgent emails just to make sure I got a front row seat to watch my daughter perform. but my chest felt like it was wrapped in a tight band of iron. I was sitting completely alone. There was an empty chair to my right, a physical reminder of the crater Brad had just blasted into our lives. He had promised Lily for a month that he would be here to see her sing. Instead, he was likely still holed up in a luxury hotel downtown, with Brittany spending whatever was left of the money he had stolen from our joint account. I kept my eyes fixed on the red velvet curtain smoothing down the skirt of my dress and practicing deep, steady breaths. I was determined to put on a brave face for my daughter. I was not going to let Brad's betrayal cast a shadow over her big day. But then the empty chair beside me scraped violently against the polished wooden floor. A suffocating wave of heavy, expensive floral perfume washed over me before I even turned my head. It was a scent I had spent the last 7 years learning to tolerate at painfully tense holiday dinners. I stiffened as Joanne, Brad's mother, lowered herself into the seat next to me. She was wearing a tailored pastel suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her neck draped in thick pearl jewelry. She clutched a designer handbag tightly in her lap, sitting rigidly upright. Joanne had always been the architect of Brad's towering narcissism. She was the woman who had spent 35 years convincing her son that he was a brilliant, misunderstood genius who deserved the world on a silver platter without ever having to work for it. Throughout our marriage, she had constantly made passive-aggressive comments about my career, implying that a real wife would spend more time cooking elaborate meals and less time in the boardroom. Yet she had absolutely no problem accepting the all-expenses, paid luxury cruises I booked for her birthdays. I did not turn to look at her. I just kept my eyes trained on the stage. "Hello, Joanne," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and polite. She did not return the greeting. Instead, she leaned in close to me, invading my personal space until I could feel her breath against my ear. She did not bother to lower her voice to a discreet volume. In fact, she spoke loudly enough that the parents sitting in the row directly in front of us actually stopped talking and turned their heads. "I hope you are happy with what you have done," Audrey Joanne hissed, her words dripping with a venom so potent it practically burned the air between us. I slowly turned my head to face her. Her expression was a mask of furious, self-righteous indignation. She looked at me not like a daughter-in-law who had just had her heart broken, but like a criminal who had finally been caught. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. The lights in the gymnasium began to dim, signaling that the show was about to start, but Joanne was just getting warmed up. "Do not play the victim with me," she snapped, her voice rising another notch. The woman sitting in front of us, a PTA mother I recognized from the bake sale committee, openly turned around and stared at us, her eyes wide with gossip, hungry curiosity. "Brad told me everything. He told me how cold and distant you have been for years. You are a frigid, work-obsessed woman who cares more about her corporate title than her own family. You drove my son away, Audrey. You pushed him right out the door because you refused to be a proper wife." The sheer audacity of her accusation hit me like a physical strike. I had spent 7 years killing myself to provide for her son. I had paid off the massive credit card debt he brought into our marriage. I had funded his ridiculous failing business ventures. I had covered the mortgage every single month while he played golf and went to networking brunches. And now she was sitting in a public auditorium, surrounded by my neighbors and fellow parents, publicly branding me as the villain for working hard enough to keep a roof over her granddaughter's head. "He is an ambitious, successful man with a massive vision." Joanne continued, her voice trembling with dramatic outrage. "He needs a woman who actually appreciates him. A woman who knows how to nurture his potential instead of constantly tearing him down and emasculating him with her own aggressive career. Brittany is a breath of fresh air. She actually respects him. She looks up to him. Something you never bothered to do." My hands clenched into tight fists in my lap. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks as more parents began to shift in their seats, openly eavesdropping on the destruction of my marriage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout that her ambitious, successful son had just drained $40,000 from his own child savings account to buy a diamond bracelet for a girl barely out of college. I wanted to tell her that his massive vision was currently drowning in millions of dollars of federal tax fraud. But I could not. Because if I engaged with her, if I caused a scene right here in the middle of the school gymnasium, I would become the hysterical, unhinged wife Brad desperately wanted me to be. I would give them exactly the narrative they were trying to build. "You need to sign those divorce papers immediately," Joanne demanded, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms over her chest, looking down her nose at me with supreme disgust. "Brad has an empire to build, and he cannot be weighed down by your dead weight anymore. Do not drag this out in court out of spite. Do not try to steal his assets just because you are bitter he found someone younger and better suited for him. Sign the papers, Audrey. Let him go so he can finally be happy." She delivered the final blow with a sickeningly triumphant smile, fully believing she had just put me exactly in my place. She thought she had publicly shamed me into submission. The silence that followed her rant was deafening. Every parent within a 10-foot radius was frozen, waiting to see if I was going to break down crying or start a screaming match right there in the front row. I took a slow, deep breath, staring directly into Joanne's smug, powdered face. I did not shed a single tear. I did not defend my honor or list my financial contributions. I just let her incredibly cruel, manipulative words hang in the heavy air. She wanted me to feel small, to feel entirely isolated and defeated. And for a fleeting second, surrounded by the judging eyes of the other school parents, the suffocating weight of the smear campaign almost worked. Before I could open my mouth to politely tell her to leave my presence, a tall, striking figure stepped out of the shadows of the aisle and walked directly toward our row, moving with the kind of absolute authority that instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. It was Naomi. My sister-in-law walked down the center aisle of the gymnasium with the poised, calculated grace of a woman who was absolutely not to be trifled with. Naomi was married to my older brother Ryan, and she was a force of nature. As a senior forensic accountant for a major corporate firm, she spent her days dismantling complex financial fraud and tearing apart the lies of wealthy, arrogant men. She had a brilliant analytical mind and a razor-sharp tongue that she rarely had to raise to completely eviscerate someone. She was dressed in a sleek charcoal gray power suit, looking entirely out of place among the casual afternoon attire of the other parents, but she did not care. Her dark eyes were locked dead onto Joanne. Naomi did not rush, but her strides were purposeful. She stopped directly at our row, placing her designer handbag on the empty folding chair between Joanne and me. She turned her body, physically blocking Joanne's line of sight to me, and looked down at my mother-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. "Excuse me, Joanne," Naomi said, her voice smooth and perfectly modulated, carrying clearly over the ambient chatter of the gymnasium. "I believe you are sitting in my seat, and frankly, you are taking up entirely too much oxygen in my sister-in-law's personal space." Joanne blinked clearly, taken aback by the sudden interruption. She straightened her posture, clutching her pearl necklace defensively. "This is a private family conversation," Joanne snapped, trying to regain her perceived authority. "I am simply giving Audrey some much-needed advice about my son. It is none of your business. You need to step aside." Naomi did not move a single inch. Instead, she let out a short, dry laugh that sounded more like a threat than an expression of amusement. "A private family conversation," Naomi repeated, her voice rising just enough to ensure the surrounding rows could hear every single syllable. "That is fascinating, Joanne, because it sounded to me like you were loudly broadcasting your son's infidelity to a room full of kindergarten parents. But since we are airing out the family laundry in public, let us make sure we have all the facts straight." I watched as the blood slowly began to drain from Joanne's powdered face. She opened her mouth to argue, but Naomi held up a single manicured hand, demanding absolute silence. "You just called Audrey dead weight," Naomi continued, her tone dangerously calm. Is that what you call the woman who paid off your son's $40,000 credit card debt before the ink on their marriage license was even dry? Or perhaps you mean the dead weight, who covered the mortgage entirely by herself for the last 7 years, while Brad played pretend CEO in his pajamas. The woman sitting in the row in front of us literally gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The whispers around us abruptly stopped as the surrounding parents tuned in to the spectacle. Joanne glanced nervously at the audience she had so eagerly cultivated just minutes ago. Her face was turning a violent mottled shade of crimson. "Lower your voice," Joanne hissed, frantically abandoning her confident posture and shrinking back into her folding chair. "You do not know what you are talking about. Brad is building an empire. He is under a massive amount of pressure." "Oh yes, his empire," Naomi countered, her voice dripping with surgical precision. "Tell me, Joanne, how exactly does missing his own daughter's 5th birthday last month to drink overpriced tequila in Miami fit into his corporate strategy?" Because I remember Audrey sitting up until midnight wiping Lily's tears while Brad ignored his phone. Is that the ambition and vision you are so proud of? Is that the behavior of a successful man who was just driven away by his frigid wife? Joanne was practically shaking now. The arrogant, self-righteous woman who had cornered me just moments before was completely dissolving under the glaring spotlight of the truth. She looked around, desperate for an ally, but the other parents were staring at her with blatant disgust. The narrative she had tried to spin about her poor, victimized son had just been entirely incinerated. "You have no right to speak to me this way," Joanne stammered, grabbing her handbag and holding it against her chest like a shield. "Brad deserves someone who supports him. He deserves to be happy." Naomi leaned down, placing both hands on the back of the metal chair, trapping Joanne in her space. "Then let him be happy," Naomi whispered loudly, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective loyalty that brought tears to my eyes. "But do not ever sit in a public room and try to publicly shame the woman who funded your entire lifestyle. Because the next time you decide to call Audrey a bad wife, I will gladly remind the entire Parent-Teacher Association who actually paid for that 2-week luxury cruise you took to the Bahamas last November. It certainly was not Brad." The silence in our section of the gymnasium was absolute. Joanne opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had been completely, utterly dismantled. She knew that if she pushed back, Naomi would not hesitate to expose every single embarrassing financial secret Brad had ever hidden. The social humiliation was too much for her to bear. Without looking at me, Joanne abruptly stood up. She shoved her way past Naomi, nearly tripping over the legs of the folding chairs, and practically ran up the center aisle. She did not stop until she reached the very last row of the gymnasium, sliding into a seat in the dark corner near the exit doors, completely out of sight. The surrounding parents immediately turned back around, suddenly fascinated by the blank stage curtain, pretending they had not just witnessed the execution of my mother-in-law. Naomi casually adjusted the lapels of her blazer, picked up her handbag, and gracefully sat down in the folding chair Joanne had just vacated. She turned to me, the icy intensity vanishing from her face, replaced by a warm, supportive smile. She reached over and gently squeezed my hand. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I took a deep, shuddering breath, feeling the crushing weight on my chest finally begin to lift. For the first time in 3 days, I did not feel entirely alone. I felt protected. I nodded, squeezing her hand back tightly. "I am now," I whispered. "Thank you. Do not ever let them make you feel small," Audrey, Naomi said, leaning her shoulder against mine as the gymnasium lights finally began to dim. "They are parasites, and they are about to find out exactly what happens when the host finally cuts them off." Right on cue, the heavy red velvet curtains pulled back, revealing a stage full of nervous 5-year-olds. My eyes immediately scanned the front row until I found Lily. She was wearing a bright yellow bumblebee costume, her little face searching the crowd. When she spotted me sitting there with Naomi, her face broke into a massive missing tooth smile, and she waved excitedly. I waved back, a genuine smile breaking across my own face, Brad was not here, and he did not deserve to be. We watched the entire recital, cheering louder than anyone else, when Lily stumbled through her designated dance steps. For that hour I let myself just be a mother, focusing entirely on the joy of my child. But beneath the surface, Naomi's words were echoing in my mind. They were parasites, and it was time to cut them off. When the recital ended, Naomi and I waited by the stage to collect Lily. After handing her a bouquet of grocery store flowers and taking a dozen pictures, I sent Lily off to get ice cream with my brother Ryan, who had been waiting out in the parking lot. I told them I needed to go over some paperwork with Naomi for a little while, and Ryan gladly took his niece off my hands for the evening. Naomi followed me back to my house. The driveway was empty. Brad had not returned since the day he dropped the divorce papers on the table. We walked through the heavy front door, the silence of the large house feeling different this time. It did not feel oppressive anymore. It felt like a staging ground. I dropped my keys on the console table and walked straight into the kitchen, pulling a bottle of dry white wine from the refrigerator. Naomi dropped her blazer over the back of a bar stool and opened her laptop on the marble kitchen island. We did not need to make small talk. She knew exactly what we were here to do. I poured 2 glasses of wine and slid one across the smooth stone counter. Then I pulled my phone out of my pocket, opened my photo gallery, and brought up the picture I had discreetly snapped of the document sticking out of Brad's leather briefcase. I placed the phone down in front of Naomi. She adjusted her glasses, leaning forward to examine the glowing screen. The red stamp of the Internal Revenue Service glared back at us. Naomi took a slow sip of her wine, her professional instincts instantly kicking in. A final notice of intent to levy, she murmured, her eyes rapidly scanning the visible text in the photograph. This is not a simple auditing error, Audrey. This is the end of the line. The IRS is preparing to seize assets. I know, I replied, pulling up a stool next to her. Brad demanded 100% ownership of his e-commerce business and the house. He threatened to take Lily if I fought him for half the assets. Naomi stopped typing and looked up at me, a sharp, calculating gleam in her eye. He is trying to isolate the assets so you cannot see the liabilities attached to them during the discovery process, she said, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. If he keeps the business and the house, he keeps the debt. But we need to know exactly how deep this hole goes before you sign anything. Give me his business identification numbers and his public registration details. I am going to see exactly what your husband has been hiding. I walked into the home office and pulled a thick manila folder from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. It contained our old tax returns and the original incorporation documents for his e-commerce business. I brought the folder back to the kitchen island and slid it across the marble counter to Naomi. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages with the rapid, practiced efficiency of a predator locking onto a scent. She typed a series of numbers into a government database on her laptop, her manicured nails clicking rhythmically against the keys. The kitchen was completely silent except for the sound of her typing and the hum of the refrigerator. For the first 45 minutes, neither of us said a word. I sat on the bar stool, nursing my glass of wine, watching the reflection of the screen in her dark eyes. I expected to find some unpaid credit cards or a few hidden bank accounts. I expected petty theft. But as the clock on the microwave ticked past 10, Naomi stopped typing. She let out a long, slow breath, leaning back in her chair. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. The silence suddenly felt suffocating, heavy, with an impending disaster I could not yet see. "What is it, Naomi?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned the laptop around so the screen was facing me. It was a digital copy of a property deed from the county clerk's office. I stared at the dense legal jargon, my eyes finally landing on the signature line at the bottom of the page. There, right next to Brad's scrawled signature, was my own name. But I had never signed that document. The loops of the letters were too tight. The angle was completely wrong. It was a crude, desperate forgery. "That is a secondary mortgage on this house," Naomi explained, her voice stripped of all emotion, delivering the facts with terrifying clarity. It was taken out 14 months ago, and it is not the only one. He took out a third line of credit against the equity of this property just 6 months ago. He used a notary public from one of his networking groups to push the paperwork through without you being present. He forged your signature, Audrey. He leveraged every single cent of equity in this $1.2 million house to secure high-interest cash loans. The air rushed out of my lungs. I reached out and touched the screen, staring at the fake signature. My own husband had committed felony fraud to steal the roof over our daughter's head. How much, I asked, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Combined with the original mortgage you have been paying, the property is currently underwater by over $800,000, Naomi said softly. And that is just the real estate. I dug into the corporate filings for his e-commerce LLC. The business is not just failing, it is a catastrophic black hole. She opened a new tab on her browser, revealing a labyrinth of financial data I could barely comprehend. Brad has not remitted payroll taxes or state sales taxes in over 3 years. Naomi continued, her finger tracing the columns of negative numbers on the screen. He has been taking investor money and using it to pay off older investors, which is essentially a localized Ponzi scheme. The IRS final notice you saw in his briefcase was not a warning. It was the execution order. The federal government is preparing to freeze all of his accounts, seize his business assets, and they will likely be passing the file over to the criminal division for tax evasion and wire fraud. I sat perfectly still, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Brad was not just a narcissist with a failing business. He was a criminal. He had built a massive, precarious house of cards, and it was currently collapsing in real time. What is the total number? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the room spinning around me. Naomi looked me dead in the eye. Between the fraudulent mortgages, the hidden business loans, and the federal tax penalties, Brad is hiding just over $2 million in active debt, she stated flatly. $2 million. The number echoed in my head, loud and terrifying. I had spent 7 years working 80-hour weeks, missing holidays, and sacrificing my own peace of mind to build a stable life. And while I was working, the man sleeping next to me had been quietly digging a $2 million grave in the dark, preparing to push me inside. If you go to a standard divorce trial and fight for an equitable split of the marital assets, the court will undergo a mandatory financial discovery. Naomi explained, her tone urgent and deadly serious. The judge will split everything 50-50. You will get half the house, half the business, and half the cars. But you will also get half of the debt. You will be legally chained to over $1 million in liabilities. Even worse, because your forged signature is on those mortgage documents, you could be dragged into the federal fraud investigation. You would have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees just to prove you were entirely innocent. It would bankrupt you. It would destroy your career. A cold, paralyzing terror washed over me. Brad knew exactly what he was doing. His arrogant demand for 100% of the assets was not driven by greed alone. It was driven by sheer desperate panic. He knew the federal government was closing in. He was trying to force me into a rapid, uncontested settlement, hoping to isolate the assets in his name so he could use the remaining equity or the business structure to negotiate a plea deal or hide the money in offshore accounts. He wanted to discard me quickly before the explosion happened, leaving me homeless, but blissfully unaware of the financial ruin attached to his name. I looked away from the laptop, staring blankly at the marble countertop. "He is going to destroy us," I whispered, the reality of the situation finally breaking through my composed exterior. If I fight him, I lose everything. If I walk away, he takes the house I paid for and leaves Lily and me with absolutely nothing. But Naomi did not look panicked. In fact, as I looked up at her, I realized she was smiling. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, dangerous smile of a woman who had just found the fatal flaw in her enemy's armor. You are looking at this all wrong, Audrey, Naomi said softly, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. Brad is an arrogant, short-sighted fool. He is so obsessed with looking wealthy and powerful that he forgot the most basic rule of contract law. When you demand sole ownership of an entity, you assume sole responsibility for its liabilities. I frowned, my mind racing to catch up with her brilliant strategic brain. What are you saying? I am saying you are going to give him exactly what he asked for, Naomi replied, picking up her wine glass and taking a slow sip. He wants the house. Give it to him. He wants the cars and the business. Let him have every single piece of it. But we are going to have your lawyer draft a very specific ironclad addendum to the settlement agreement. An indemnification clause combined with a quitclaim deed. By legally accepting 100% of the assets as his sole and separate property, Brad will also legally assume 100% of the debts, liens, and tax burdens attached to them, both known and unknown. The genius of the plan hit me like a bolt of lightning. The heavy, crushing weight on my chest vanished instantly. He thinks he is stealing your wealth, Naomi continued, leaning across the counter, her eyes shining with fierce triumph. He thinks he is leaving you destitute. He has no idea that you know about the debt. If you play the part of the defeated, broken wife, if you act like you are simply giving up because you are too exhausted to fight his high-powered lawyers, he will sign that indemnification clause without a second thought. He will be so eager to steal the crown that he will not realize it is wired with explosives. A genuine breathless laugh escaped my lips. It was the first time I had laughed in days. Brad was using his own narcissism to build his own guillotine. He thought his intimidation tactics were forcing me into submission. He thought threatening to take Lily was the masterstroke that would make me walk away from my rightful half of the marital estate. He had no idea he was actually handing me the scissors to completely sever myself from his impending federal indictment. I picked up my glass of wine, raising it slightly in the air. Tomorrow morning I am calling my lawyer, I said, feeling a fierce, unstoppable energy surging through my veins. I am going to draft the paperwork. I am going to walk into that mediation room, look him in the eye, and hand him the entire empire. Naomi clinked her glass against mine, the crystal ringing clearly in the quiet kitchen. Let him wear the crown, Audrey, she said with a vicious grin. Let us see how he likes it when the castle burns down around him. I took a long sip of the dry wine, the taste sweeter than anything I had ever experienced. The trap was set. All I had to do now was let Brad confidently walk right into it. I walked into the downtown office of my divorce attorney, Richard, early the next morning. The air conditioning was running high, making the opulent reception area feel like a very expensive icebox. Richard was a seasoned veteran of family law. He had silver hair, a sharp tailored suit, and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in the courtroom. I had hired him specifically because he was known for destroying men who tried to hide assets during a divorce. I sat down in one of the heavy leather chairs opposite his massive mahogany desk. Richard folded his hands and looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses, expecting me to give him the green light to unleash a legal war against Brad. Instead, I looked him dead in the eye and told him to draft a settlement agreement, giving my husband exactly what he demanded. Give him 100% of the marital home, I instructed, keeping my voice perfectly flat. Give him both luxury SUVs, and draft a clause relinquishing any and all of my rights claims or interests in his e-commerce business. He wants it all. Let him have it. Richard stared at me as if I had just started speaking in tongues. He dropped his pen on the desk, the sharp clatter breaking the heavy silence in the room. Audrey, he said, leaning forward with a look of genuine professional panic. Absolutely not. I will not allow you to do this. You are acting out of emotional exhaustion, which is completely understandable given the circumstances, but you cannot make permanent financial decisions while you are in a state of trauma. I am not traumatized, Richard, I replied calmly. I am giving you instructions. He shook his head vigorously, refusing to accept my answer. Brad is trying to intimidate you, Richard insisted, his voice rising with protective frustration. He is counting on you being too exhausted to fight. That house has over $400,000 in equity that you paid for. His business, regardless of how it is currently performing, is a marital asset. If you sign over everything, you will be walking away with absolutely nothing. You will be starting your life over from zero while he lives in a mansion with his mistress. I am your attorney, and I am telling you that this is financial suicide. I will not draft those papers. I let him finish his passionate defense of my future. I appreciated his dedication. He was exactly the kind of lawyer I needed, a man who genuinely cared about protecting his clients. But he did not have the whole picture. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick, heavy manila folder Naomi and I had compiled the night before. I placed it on the edge of his polished mahogany desk and slowly pushed it across the smooth surface until it rested right in front of him. "Read it," I said softly. Richard looked from the folder to my face, his brow furrowed in confusion. He reached out, flipped open the cover, and began to read the first page. It was the forged secondary mortgage document. His eyes scanned the text, his professional demeanor shifting from frustration to sudden, intense focus. He turned to the next page. The third line of credit. Then the corporate tax filings. Then the photograph of the IRS final notice of intent to levy. For 10 straight minutes, the only sound in the office was the rustling of heavy paper as Richard meticulously reviewed the financial autopsy of Brad's fake empire. I watched the color slowly drain from his face. His jaw tightened and he let out a low, breathless whistle. "This is a $2 million debt crater," Richard whispered, looking up at me with absolute horror. "He committed mortgage fraud. He forged your signature." "Audrey, if this goes to a standard trial and the judge orders a 50-50 split of the marital estate, you are going to be legally responsible for half of this catastrophe. The federal government could freeze your personal bank accounts just by association. Federal tax liens attached to everything, including your future earnings. They could garnish your corporate salary. They could drain the college fund you set up for Lily." "I know," I replied, leaning back in my leather chair. "Which is exactly why I do not want half." Richard blinked, the wheels turning rapidly in his brilliant legal mind. He looked back down at the forged mortgage document, and then his eyes widened as the sheer genius of the strategy finally dawned on him. "He wants the house and the business." I continued, my voice steady and calculated. "He threatened to take Lily away from me if I fought him for the assets. He is so desperate to hoard his perceived wealth and hide his crimes from me that he is blinded by his own arrogance. So we are going to use his greed against him." Richard slowly sat back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "You want to give him the assets, so he absorbs the liabilities," he concluded, his voice filled with newfound respect. "Exactly," I nodded. "I want you to draft the most ironclad, bulletproof settlement agreement of your entire career. I want a quitclaim deed transferring all of my interest in the property directly to him. But more importantly, I want a comprehensive indemnification clause. I want it explicitly stated in the legal text that by assuming 100% ownership of the real estate and the corporate entities, Brad agrees to assume 100% of all associated debts, encumbrances, tax liabilities, and liens, both known and unknown." Richard picked up his pen again, tapping it thoughtfully against the desk. "He will be so thrilled that you are surrendering the physical assets that he will not even question the liability clauses," Richard said, his mind already formulating the legal trap. "He will just see it as standard boilerplate language. He will think he bullied you into walking away with nothing." "And what about the forged signature on the mortgage?" I asked, needing to be absolutely sure I was protected. Richard pulled a fresh notepad toward him and started taking rapid notes. "Once the final decree is signed by the judge, Brad legally claims the debt as his sole responsibility. If the bank or the federal government ever tries to come after you for the forged loans, we present the court-ordered settlement, proving he assumed the entire financial burden of the property. We essentially sever your financial identity from his right before the bomb goes off. You will be completely untouchable. I felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. The terrifying weight of the $2 million debt was no longer a noose around my neck. It was a weapon I was about to hand directly to my enemy. There is only one thing I want out of this marriage, I told Richard, leaning forward and resting my hands on his desk. I want full, unshared physical and legal custody of Lily. Put that in the settlement. Tell him he can have his precious empire, but he has to waive all parental rights. He already told me he does not want to deal with school drop-offs. He will sign it just to get rid of the inconvenience so he can play bachelor with his new girlfriend. Richard looked at me, closing the manila folder and resting his hands on top of it. He was no longer looking at me like a traumatized, exhausted wife. He was looking at me like a master chess player who had just orchestrated the perfect checkmate. I have been practicing family law for 30 years, Audrey, Richard said, a genuine note of awe in his voice. And I have never seen a trap quite as flawless as this one. Your husband is walking into the mediation room thinking he is going to shear a sheep. He has no idea he is walking straight into a slaughterhouse. Draft the papers, Richard, I said, standing up from my chair and smoothing down the front of my skirt. Make the language so dense with legal benefits for him that his own attorneys overlook the poison pill hidden inside the indemnification. Let us give Brad exactly the divorce he asked for. The morning of the mediation arrived with a heavy gray sky that perfectly matched the sterile, cold atmosphere of the downtown legal building. Richard and I arrived early. We sat on one side of a long glass conference table in a room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and burnt coffee. The mediator, a mild-mannered older man with kind eyes, sat at the head of the table organizing his notes. We waited in silence for 15 minutes past the scheduled start time. It was a classic transparent power play. Brad wanted to make sure everyone in the room knew his time was more valuable than ours. When the heavy oak door finally swung open, the sheer audacity of what walked through it nearly made Richard break character. Brad swaggered into the room as if he had just won a championship title. He was wearing a brand-new custom-tailored navy blue suit that I knew for a fact cost upwards of $3,000. On his wrist flashed the gold Rolex I had purchased for him, and his hair was perfectly styled. But it was the woman clinging to his arm that brought a sudden tense silence to the room. It was Brittany. She was wearing a pristine white designer dress and carrying a quilted Chanel handbag that easily retailed for $7,000. I recognized the subtle sparkle of the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. They were dripping in luxury, and every single thread of it had been paid for by the money Brad had stolen from my hard-earned savings account. Richard immediately stiffened, his lawyer instincts flaring. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "This is a closed legal mediation regarding marital assets. Only the involved parties and their counsel are permitted in this room. The young lady needs to wait in the lobby." Brad rolled his eyes and let out a loud, obnoxious sigh, pulling out a chair for Brittany right next to him. "Brittany is my life partner and my business advisor," Brad stated smoothly, sitting down and crossing his legs. "She has a vested interest in the outcome of this settlement, seeing as she will be living in the house and helping me run the company. If she leaves, I leave, and we can just take this to trial." Richard opened his mouth to argue, fully prepared to throw them both out and demand a court date. But before he could speak, I reached out and gently placed my hand over his forearm. I lowered my chin, letting my shoulders slump forward, and stared down at the blank legal pad in front of me. "Let her stay," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound small, fragile, and utterly defeated. "I just want to get this over with. Please, Richard, do not fight him on this." Richard looked at me, playing his part flawlessly. He let out a heavy, frustrated sigh, shaking his head in theatrical disappointment before leaning back in his chair. Brad practically beamed with triumph. He had won the very first battle of the morning, forcing my lawyer to back down. He glanced at Brittany and gave her a smug, victorious wink. He truly believed his intimidation tactics had completely broken my spirit. He had no idea I wanted her in the room. I wanted her to sit right there and watch him sign away their entire future. The mediator cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the dynamic, and opened the floor. For the next 30 minutes, Brad did not just negotiate. He launched a relentless, calculated monologue designed to humiliate me and elevate his own fragile ego. He spoke entirely to the mediator and Richard, acting as though I was barely human enough to address directly. Audrey simply does not have the financial literacy to manage complex assets, Brad declared, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the glass table. She works in middle management at a logistics firm. She moves boxes for a living. She is a corporate drone who relies on a steady paycheck because she has absolutely no vision. If you give her half of my e-commerce business, she will bankrupt it within a month because she does not understand the aggressive mindset of an entrepreneur. I kept my head down, staring at my hands resting in my lap. I let him insult my career. The very career that had paid for the suit he was wearing and the food he had eaten for the last 7 years. Furthermore, Brad continued, gesturing casually toward me. She has already begun looking at a cramped 2-bedroom rented apartment near the highway. That is the lifestyle she is comfortable with. Mediocrity. I, on the other hand, entertain high-net-worth investors. I need the marital home. I need the space and the address to project the proper image for my brand. Audrey does not need a $1.2 million estate. It would be a complete waste of resources. He was practically glowing with self-importance. Every cruel word that left his mouth, every condescending remark about my supposed lack of ambition was another shovel of dirt he was throwing onto his own grave. He was building an ironclad argument for why he and he alone should take full ownership of the assets. He was doing all the heavy lifting for us, completely unaware that his beloved business and his precious estate were actually ticking time bombs of federal debt. I must advise my client on the record that walking away from the marital estate is highly irregular, Richard interjected, using his best tone of professional desperation. Audrey contributed significantly to the down payment of the home and the household operating expenses. Brad let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed loudly in the small room. Contributed, he scoffed, shaking his head. She paid the electric bill a few times. I am the one who built the wealth. I am the one taking the massive risks. Taking the house and the business is not stealing Richard. It is claiming what is rightfully mine. I am the man of the house, and I am taking on the burden of managing these massive assets. Audrey is giving up easily because she knows deep down she does not deserve any of it. She does not have the stomach for high-level asset management. I squeezed my eyes shut, letting out a soft, shaky breath that sounded exactly like a woman on the verge of tears. Inside, my heart was racing with a fierce, cold adrenaline. He had just said the magic words. He had explicitly stated in front of a licensed mediator that he wanted to take on the complete burden of the assets. Are you absolutely certain you want to take full and sole ownership of the e-commerce limited liability company and the real estate property? Richard asked, his voice carefully neutral, leaning in just a fraction. Because if my client agrees to walk away, you will be assuming total responsibility for those entities. I welcome the responsibility. Brad fired back instantly, puffing out his chest. I am the only one equipped to handle it. You just draft the paperwork to sever her from my companies and my house, and I will gladly sign it. I want a clean break so I can finally build my life with someone who actually supports me. He reached over and squeezed Brittany's hand. She smiled back at him, completely oblivious to the fact that she was holding hands with a man who was $2 million in debt and actively under federal investigation. I slowly lifted my head and looked directly at Brad. My eyes were completely dry, but I kept my expression hollow and submissive. You can have the house, Brad, I whispered softly. You can have the business. You can have the cars. I do not want any of your money. I just want out. Brad's arrogant grin stretched from ear to ear. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms behind his head, soaking in the absolute victory. He had bullied his wife into walking away from $1 million in equity. He had secured his fake empire. Richard reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He slid them across the glass table toward Brad. The trap had been set perfectly, and Brad was practically begging to step inside. Brad picked up the heavy silver pen resting on the glass table. He flipped carelessly through the first few pages of the settlement, completely ignoring the dense paragraphs of legal text Richard had meticulously crafted. He was scanning for numbers, looking for the percentages that confirmed he was getting exactly what he demanded. When he saw the clauses explicitly granting him sole ownership of the marital home, the luxury vehicles, and his failing e-commerce business, a sickeningly smug smile spread across his face. "Wait," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Brad stopped the pen, hovering just an inch above the signature line. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing with sudden suspicion. "What is it now, Audrey?" he snapped, clearly annoyed that I was interrupting his moment of triumph. "I told you I am not negotiating." "I am not negotiating either," I replied, keeping my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide how badly they were shaking. "I am simply stating my conditions. You can have the entire marital estate, but in exchange I have exactly two demands. First, I retain 100% of my personal savings account, the one you have not touched yet. Second, and most importantly, I want full unshared sole physical and legal custody of Lily. You will waive all parental rights, visitation schedules, and decision-making authority." The mediator, who had been quietly taking notes, stopped writing and looked up at Brad with a deeply concerned expression. "Mr. Sullivan," the mediator said gently, "waiving your parental rights is an extreme and permanent measure. The court generally favors joint custody. Are you absolutely certain you want to sever your legal relationship with your daughter?" Brad did not even hesitate. He actually let out a short, dismissive laugh, leaning back in his chair and gesturing toward Brittany. "Listen, I love my kid," he lied smoothly, not an ounce of genuine emotion in his voice. "But Audrey is right. I am entering a massive growth phase with my companies. I am going to be traveling, networking, and building a legacy. I cannot be tied down by weekend custody schedules or arguing over what elementary school she goes to. Brittany and I are focusing on our future right now. If Audrey wants to take on the full burden of raising her, that works out perfectly for everyone. It is the deal of the century." He turned his attention back to me, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "You keep the kid, Audrey," he sneered. "I will keep the empire. We will see who comes out on top in 5 years." It took every ounce of strength I possessed not to reach across the table and strike him. The casual, callous way he discarded our 5-year-old daughter, speaking about her as if she were an annoying logistical hurdle rather than a human being, was breathtakingly cruel. But beneath the sharp sting of his rejection, a massive, overwhelming wave of relief washed over me. He was giving me exactly what I wanted. He was legally binding himself out of our daughter's life forever. He would never be able to use her as a pawn or a weapon against me again. "Fine," I whispered, forcing myself to look down at the table so he would not see the fierce, protective victory shining in my eyes. "Just sign the papers, Brad." Brad eagerly uncapped the pen. He did not ask his own attorney to review the addendums. He was so blinded by his own greed, so completely consumed by the desire to hoard the assets and humiliate me, that he signed his name on the dotted line without reading a single word of the indemnification clause. He initialed the page, transferring the $1.2 million property into his sole name. He initialed the page, accepting full ownership of the e-commerce business. And with one final sweeping stroke of the pen, he signed the document, assuming 100% of all associated liabilities, debts, and federal tax burdens. Richard sat perfectly still, his face an impenetrable mask of professional indifference, but I could see the subtle, triumphant tightening of his jaw. He methodically gathered the signed documents, double-checking every single signature and initial to ensure the trap was legally airtight. "Well," Brad announced, slapping his hands down on the glass table and standing up, He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and shot me a look of pure, unadulterated arrogance. I have to admit, Audrey, I thought you would put up more of a fight. But I guess you finally realized you were completely outmatched. Enjoy your rented apartment. Brittany and I have a house to redecorate. He did not shake the mediator's hand. He did not say goodbye. He just turned on his heel and walked out the heavy oak door, Brittany trailing right behind him, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. As soon as the door clicked shut, the oppressive tension in the room instantly evaporated. The mediator let out a long, heavy sigh, shaking his head as he packed up his briefcase. I have seen a lot of selfish men in my career, the mediator muttered quietly. But that was truly something else. I am so sorry you had to go through that, Audrey. I looked at Richard, who was carefully sliding the signed settlement into his leather folder. He looked back at me, and a slow, brilliant smile broke across his face. Do not be sorry, Richard said, his voice ringing with absolute satisfaction. She just executed the most flawless legal maneuver I have ever witnessed. I left the mediation center feeling lighter than I had in years. The crisp afternoon air felt like a physical cleanse as I walked to my car. I had done it. I had successfully amputated the rotting toxic limb from my life, and I had secured my daughter's absolute safety. All that was left now was to wait for the infection to completely consume him. I did not have to wait long to see the immediate aftermath of his supposed victory. Later that afternoon, I was sitting on the floor of my new modest townhome, unpacking a box of Lily's favorite books. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text message from Naomi containing nothing but a single link to Instagram and a popcorn emoji. I opened the link. It was a public video posted to Brittany's social media account just 20 minutes ago. The caption read, "Officially moving into our new mansion. So proud of my CEO fiancé for securing our empire." I tapped the screen and the video began to play. Brittany was holding the camera high, panning slowly across the expansive sunlit living room of my former home. She twirled around in her white designer dress, giggling as she showed off the custom emerald green velvet sofa I had spent 3 months selecting. Brad walked into the frame holding 2 glasses of expensive champagne. He wrapped his arm around her waist, kissing her cheek for the camera, looking like a man who had just conquered the world. "Welcome to our new life, baby," Brad practically shouted into the phone, raising his champagne glass toward the lens. "Only upward from here. No more dead weight holding us back." The video ended with Brittany blowing a kiss to her followers. I sat there on the floor of my quiet, peaceful living room, and a genuine, deeply satisfying laugh bubbled up from my chest. I watched the video a second time, analyzing the smug confidence radiating from both of them. They were standing in a house that was underwater by $800,000. They were drinking champagne paid for by a business that was millions of dollars in debt to the federal government. They had just publicly claimed ownership of a massive sinking ship, and they were throwing a party on the deck while the water was already pouring into the hull. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the sofa. Let them drink their champagne, I thought to myself, opening another box of books. Because the hangover they were about to wake up to was going to be absolutely spectacular. The sheer audacity of Brad did not stop at stealing my savings and my home. 4 days after the mediation papers were signed, a thick cream-colored envelope with gold foil lettering arrived at my logistics office. It was addressed to my entire department. I opened it at my desk, staring in absolute disbelief at the printed text. "You are invited to the official Sullivan Empire housewarming and divorce celebration, hosted by Brad and Brittany." It listed the address of the $1.2 million home I had purchased. He had actually mailed formal invitations to my coworkers, my industry contacts, and my own family members. He wanted an audience. He wanted the people who respected me to come and witness his grand victory, to see him standing in my house with his younger girlfriend, proving once and for all that he was the superior partner. My desk phone rang 10 minutes later. It was my brother Ryan. His voice was shaking with a rage I had rarely heard from him. He had just pulled the same gold-foiled invitation out of his mailbox. He wanted to drive over there immediately and put Brad through a front window. I had to spend 20 minutes talking him down. Do not give him the satisfaction, Ryan, I told him, keeping my own voice perfectly calm. He wants us to be angry. He wants us to look bitter and unhinged. Just throw the invitation in the trash. My coworkers were equally disgusted, with several of them offering to draft a strongly worded group email telling Brad exactly where he could shove his ridiculous card. But I told them the same thing. Silence is a much more devastating weapon than anger. But while I told everyone else to stay away and ignore the bait, I had my own specific reason to make a brief appearance. The night before, Brad had sent me an incredibly demanding text message. He insisted I return a box of his old college business competition trophies that had accidentally been packed with my things when I moved into my townhome. He called them his legacy items and threatened to have his lawyer draft a formal complaint if I did not hand them over immediately. The trophies were nothing but cheap plastic painted gold, mostly honorable mentions, and runner-up plaques from intramural marketing debates. They were the perfect physical representation of Brad's entire life, fake gold masking a foundation of absolute mediocrity. Instead of paying to mail them, I decided I would hand-deliver them, right in the middle of his spectacular party. I called Naomi and she immediately agreed to ride shotgun. I did not dress up for a party, but I did not look like a defeated victim either. I wore a tailored black blazer, dark jeans, and my favorite leather boots. I looked like a woman who was stepping away from her desk to run a quick errand. Naomi arrived at my townhome looking fiercely elegant in a burgundy trench coat. She helped me load the heavy cardboard box into the trunk of my car, a knowing, dangerous smile playing on her lips. We drove across town toward my old neighborhood, the crisp evening air rushing through the cracked windows. As we turned onto my former street, the sheer scale of Brad's delusion became entirely visible. The quiet suburban road was packed with expensive luxury vehicles, most of which I assumed were leased by his networking friends. He had actually hired a valet service to park cars in the cul-de-sac. A massive white catering tent was set up on the manicured front lawn I used to mow myself. Thumping heavy bass from a professional sound system vibrated through the windows of my car. I slowed down, taking in the absolute absurdity of the scene. Brad was burning through the absolute last of the stolen $40,000 to throw a party, celebrating his own impending doom. He was popping expensive champagne to toast the acquisition of a house that was completely underwater and about to be seized by the federal government. Naomi let out a low whistle from the passenger seat. "He really does not do anything halfway, does he?" she murmured, shaking her head. "He is throwing a festival on the deck of the Titanic. Let him enjoy the music while it lasts," I replied, putting the car in park a block away from the house. We bypassed the valet stand entirely. I popped the trunk and lifted the heavy cardboard box full of plastic trophies. Naomi walked beside me, her posture perfectly straight, radiating an intimidating, quiet confidence that made people naturally step out of her way. We walked up the wide concrete driveway, passing groups of Brad's business associates who were smoking cigars and laughing loudly. A few of them recognized me from corporate holiday events. Their conversations instantly died. They stared at me, their eyes wide with shock, holding their drinks frozen mid-air. They expected me to be at home crying into a pillow. They did not expect me to confidently stride right up to the front door of my own stolen house. I did not bother to knock. I reached out, turned the heavy brass handle, and pushed the door open. The entryway was packed with people. Brittany had already begun erasing my presence from the home. She had completely rearranged the furniture, replacing my tasteful decor with flashy modern art pieces that looked like they belonged in a cheap nightclub. The air smelled of expensive catered seafood and spilled alcohol. As Naomi and I stepped into the foyer, the ripple effect of our presence spread rapidly through the room. One by one, people stopped talking. The loud hip-hop music kept playing, but the party atmosphere instantly evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. Guests parted like the Red Sea as I walked forward, keeping my face entirely blank. I carried the heavy box of fake gold trophies with purpose, looking around the expansive living room for the man of the hour. I could feel the weight of 100 eyes burning into my back, watching my every move, waiting for me to scream or cause a scene. But I was completely at peace. I was a ghost haunting a house that no longer belonged to me, bringing the final piece of garbage back to its rightful owner. I stood at the edge of the sunken living room, with the heavy cardboard box digging into my palms. The sheer volume of the party had masked our entrance for only a few seconds before the whispers started. Guests nudged each other, pointing subtly in my direction. The sea of designer dresses and tailored jackets parted, creating a clear line of sight from the front door directly to the sweeping double staircase at the far end of the room. Brad was standing halfway up the carpeted steps with a crystal glass in his hand. Brittany was leaning against the polished oak banister beside him. When his eyes locked onto mine, a flash of genuine surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by a dark, predatory gleam. He had wanted an audience, and now the main attraction had arrived. Brad raised his hand and snapped his fingers at the DJ hired for the evening. The heavy bass of the hip-hop track cut out instantly. The sudden silence in the massive room was deafening. "Well, look who decided to crash the celebration," Brad announced, his voice booming across the quiet room. He did not walk down the stairs to greet me. He stayed exactly where he was, utilizing the physical elevation to look down on me. He took a slow sip of his champagne, swirling the golden liquid in his glass. "I have to admit, Audrey, I did not think you would actually show up. I thought you would be too busy unpacking your rented apartment to mingle with high-net-worth individuals. But I guess when you lose everything, you just cannot resist coming back to see how the other half lives." A few of his business associates chuckled nervously, but most of the guests remained perfectly silent, shifting uncomfortably on their feet. Naomi stood shoulder to shoulder with me, her eyes locked onto Brad with the cold intensity of a sniper. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I simply stood there, holding the box of his worthless plastic trophies, waiting for him to finish his theatrical performance. Brad mistook my silence for humiliation. He thought I was frozen by embarrassment, and he eagerly leaned into his cruelty. "Everybody, let us give a warm welcome to my ex-wife," Brad called out, gesturing grandly toward me with his free hand. He raised his voice so that every single person in the caterer-filled kitchen and the adjacent dining room could hear him. "Audrey here is a prime example of what happens when you lack vision. For 7 years, she tried to keep me grounded. She tried to make me settle for a mediocre middle-class existence. But true ambition cannot be caged. Look around you. Look at this magnificent estate. Look at the empire I have built. I offered her a chance to be part of greatness, but she simply did not have the stomach for it." He walked down 2 steps, pulling Brittany close to his side. Brittany smiled smugly, running her hand down the front of her white dress. When the pressure got too high, when the negotiations for this $1.2 million estate began, Audrey folded like a cheap lawn chair. Brad continued, his tone dripping with fake pity. "She signed over everything because she knew she did not belong in this tax bracket. She walked away from the house, the business, and the luxury vehicles. In fact, I saw her pull up in the driveway just now. She drove here in a rented Honda sedan. Can you imagine that? A rented Honda parked next to a driveway full of Porsches and Mercedes? It is poetic, really. The universe always puts people exactly where they belong." He paused, expecting a massive reaction. He wanted me to drop the box. He wanted me to burst into tears and run out the heavy mahogany front door so he could turn to his friends and laugh about my emotional instability. He had carefully orchestrated this entire moment to establish absolute dominance, to prove to his investors and his new girlfriend that he was the undisputed victor of our divorce. He wanted to break me in front of 50 witnesses. But I did not break. I did not even blink. I stood with perfect, unwavering posture, my shoulders pulled back and my chin held high. I looked at the tailored suit he had bought with my stolen savings. I looked at the diamond bracelet glittering on Brittany's wrist. I looked at the beautiful sweeping staircase of the home that was currently drowning in $800,000 of fraudulent debt. I saw a man who was standing on a trapdoor with a thick rope around his neck, loudly bragging to a crowd about the exceptional quality of the knot. The tension in the living room became thick and suffocating. The guests who had initially been captivated by the drama began to realize that I was not participating in the humiliation. My absolute unbreakable calm made Brad's aggressive speech look pathetic and unhinged. People started clearing their throats. A woman near the front door quietly set her champagne glass down on a side table and looked away, unable to bear the awkwardness. The power dynamic in the room was rapidly shifting, and Brad could feel it slipping through his fingers. Brad's smile tightened. The muscle in his jaw began to jump. He had fired his absolute best shots. He had publicly mocked my vehicle, my living situation, and my career, and I had absorbed it all without a single scratch. He opened his mouth to launch another insult, trying desperately to regain control of the audience, but he was completely out of ammunition. He was just a loud, desperate man standing on a staircase shouting at a woman who clearly no longer cared that he existed. I held his gaze for 5 long, agonizing seconds, letting the silence stretch until it was almost physically painful for the people watching. I wanted everyone in that room to remember this exact moment. I wanted them to remember how arrogant and boastful he was, so that when the federal indictments hit the local news cycle, there would be absolutely no question about his guilt. I shifted the weight of the cardboard box in my arms, preparing to deliver the final piece of his hollow legacy, ready to set the stage for the explosion that would wipe his entire empire off the map. I took a step forward, closing the distance between the center of the room and the bottom of the sweeping staircase. Brad tightened his grip on the banister, his knuckles turning white. I did not walk up the steps to meet him. I simply tilted the heavy cardboard box forward and let it drop. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a loud, unceremonious thud. The cardboard flaps fell open, spilling a cascade of cheap plastic gold trophies, honorable mention ribbons, and participation plaques across the floor. They scattered around his expensive leather shoes like absolute garbage. "Here is your legacy, Brad," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silent room. "Make sure you polish them. It is the only gold you have left." Brad's face flushed a deep, furious red. He opened his mouth to shout, to launch another barrage of insults, but before he could form a single word, Naomi made her move. She had been standing just slightly behind me, holding a massive, overfilled crystal glass of deep burgundy red wine she had casually picked up from a catering tray. As Brad took an aggressive step down the stairs toward me, Brittany pushed past him, her face contorted with anger, ready to defend her man. Naomi simply shifted her weight. It was the most graceful, perfectly calculated accident I had ever witnessed. As Brittany stomped down the final step, Naomi turned her heel, seemingly catching on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. She stumbled forward directly into Brittany's path. The heavy crystal glass tipped, and an entire pint of dark red wine splashed violently across the front of Brittany's pristine $7,000 white designer dress. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed off the high ceilings. She frantically clawed at the front of her ruined dress, watching in absolute horror as the dark crimson stain rapidly spread across the expensive silk, completely destroying it in a matter of seconds. "Oh my God!" she screamed, her voice cracking in a high-pitched wail. "My dress! You ruined my dress!" Total chaos erupted in the living room. Brad lunged forward, grabbing Brittany's shoulders, shouting wildly at Naomi. "What is wrong with you?" he roared, his carefully constructed facade of a cool, collected billionaire completely shattering into pieces. "Look what you did. Are you crazy? Get out of my house right now." Naomi did not flinch. She slowly righted herself, casually brushing an invisible speck of dust off her charcoal blazer. She looked at the ruined white dress, then looked directly into Brad's furious eyes and offered a cold, entirely unapologetic smile. "My deepest apologies, Brad," Naomi said smoothly, her tone dripping with absolute sarcasm. "I suppose I just lack the vision to see where I am walking. You should really have your cleaning staff get on that stain immediately. Oh wait, you cannot afford them anymore. The guests around us began murmuring loudly, some stepping backward, to avoid the crossfire, others openly whispering about the scene unfolding in front of them. The sophisticated high-class celebration had instantly devolved into a spectacular, messy reality show, and Brad was standing right in the center of the wreckage. He was hyperventilating, completely losing control of the narrative he had tried so hard to build. He pointed a shaking finger at the front door, his face purple with rage, demanding that we leave immediately. I did not need to be told twice. My work here was done. I turned around, my boots clicking sharply against the floor, and began to walk toward the foyer. But just before I reached the heavy mahogany doors, I paused. I turned my head, looking back over my shoulder at the man who had tried to destroy me. He was standing in a puddle of spilled wine and scattered plastic trophies, trying to soothe a hysterically crying 24-year-old girl. He looked incredibly small. "Brad," I called out softly. The tone of my voice was so unnervingly calm that it cut straight through the shouting and the chaos. He stopped yelling and looked up at me, his chest heaving. "Enjoy the house, Brad," I whispered, making sure my words carried directly to him. "And make sure you check the basement." I saw the exact moment the confusion hit him. His brow furrowed and his aggressive posture faltered. He opened his mouth to ask what I meant, but I did not give him the chance. I turned my back to him, pushed open the front doors, and walked out into the cool evening air alongside Naomi. We did not speak until we reached my car. Once the doors were closed and the engine was running, Naomi looked at me and we both burst into uncontrollable, breathless laughter. We drove away, leaving the party and the wreckage entirely behind us. Brad did not understand my warning about the basement. He did not know that the basement was where I kept the old locked filing cabinets containing every single piece of his original corporate paperwork, the very paperwork the federal government would be looking for. He spent the rest of the night furiously trying to salvage his ruined party, assuring his investors that I was just a bitter, jealous ex-wife making empty threats. By the time the last guest left and the caterers packed up, it was well past midnight. Brad and Brittany went to sleep in the massive master bedroom, completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering just over the horizon. At exactly 6:00 the next morning, the storm broke. The sun had barely risen over the manicured suburban street when a fleet of unmarked black SUVs and 2 local police cruisers pulled up to the driveway of the $1.2 million estate. The heavy, rhythmic pounding on the mahogany front door echoed through the quiet neighborhood loud enough to wake the neighbors. Brad stumbled out of bed, his head pounding with a severe champagne hangover. He threw on a silk robe and hurried down the sweeping staircase, furious that someone was disturbing his Sunday morning. He yanked the front door open, an angry insult already forming on his lips. But the words died instantly in his throat. Standing on his front porch were 6 armed federal agents, wearing tactical vests, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Flanking them was a representative from the county sheriff's office holding a thick stack of legal documents. Brad stared at them, the last remnants of his arrogant bravado instantly evaporating, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror. Brad Sullivan, the lead federal agent, stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We are executing a federal search warrant for this premises regarding multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and forged financial instruments. Furthermore, we are serving you with immediate foreclosure notices on behalf of your secondary mortgage lenders. Please step aside, sir." Brad tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He raised a shaking hand, desperately trying to block the doorway. "There must be some mistake," he stammered, his face turning the color of ash. "This is my house. I own this company. I just finalized the paperwork yesterday." "That is exactly why we are here, Mr. Sullivan," the agent replied coldly, pushing past him into the foyer. "Because you claim sole ownership, you are now legally responsible for the $2.4 million owed to the federal government. Secure the basement. We are looking for the financial records." Brittany appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching her robe, screaming in terror. As federal agents flooded into the living room, seizing computers, opening drawers, and boxing up the fake empire Brad had built, Brad collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the hardwood floor. In that horrifying crystal-clear moment, my final warning echoed in his mind. He finally realized that the divorce settlement was not a surrender. It was a perfectly laid trap, and he had eagerly locked himself inside. Just 4 hours after the federal agents tore through his basement and handed him a stack of catastrophic financial notices, we arrived at the downtown family court building for the final hearing. The morning air was thick with humidity, but as I walked up the wide concrete steps of the courthouse, I felt completely weightless. The heavy marble columns and the imposing architecture of the legal building usually made people feel small and intimidated. For me, it felt like the gateway to my absolute freedom. Richard walked beside me carrying his worn leather briefcase that contained the flawlessly drafted settlement agreement. He was wearing his sharpest suit, his face set in an expression of serious professional determination. Today was the day the trap would permanently lock into place. We passed through the metal detectors and took the elevator up to the 4th floor. The hallway outside the courtroom was lined with rigid wooden benches and echoed with the hushed, anxious conversations of other separating couples. I spotted Brad immediately. He was standing near the heavy double doors of our assigned courtroom, furiously whispering to his own attorney. He was wearing an immaculate tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly slicked back, projecting the image of a wealthy, unbothered executive. But the cracks in his carefully constructed facade were glaringly obvious. There was a visible sheen of cold sweat on his forehead that he kept aggressively wiping away with a pocket square. His hands were shaking slightly as he gestured toward his lawyer. The early morning federal raid had absolutely rattled him to his core, but his textbook narcissism was still driving his every move. I knew exactly what he was thinking. Brad truly believed he was smarter than the Internal Revenue Service and the federal investigators. He had convinced himself that the massive debt and the foreclosure notices were simply temporary hurdles that he could easily overcome if he just had the right leverage. In his deeply delusional mind, he needed this divorce decree, stamped by a judge immediately. He believed that once the paperwork was finalized, he would have sole undisputed legal ownership of the $1.2 million estate and the corporate entities completely free from my interference. He was planning to take those assets and rapidly liquidate them, or perhaps use his new title as sole owner to secure even more fraudulent high-interest loans to pay off his immediate tax penalties. He thought he could outmaneuver the federal government by shifting his stolen money around. He was rushing toward the finish line, desperate to secure the assets that were actually going to drown him. Brittany was standing a few feet away from him, and the contrast in her demeanor from the mediation session was incredibly stark. She was no longer clinging to his arm or smiling smugly at me. She was wearing a simple, understated dress, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. She looked pale and entirely traumatized. Waking up to armed federal agents tearing through her newly claimed mansion had clearly shattered her gold-digger fantasy. She kept glancing nervously down the hallway, looking less like a proud fiancé and more like a hostage looking for an escape route. Brad ignored her, completely entirely focused on bullying his lawyer into rushing the proceedings. When Brad finally noticed me walking down the corridor, he stopped talking and shot me a vicious, dirty look. He squared his shoulders, trying to project dominance. He fully expected me to walk over and demand a renegotiation. He probably assumed that I had heard about the federal raid through the neighborhood grapevine, and that I would try to use the impending bankruptcy to halt the divorce. He thought I would panic, demand my fair share of whatever equity was left, or beg the judge to restructure the settlement to protect myself. He wanted a fight because a fight would validate his ego. He wanted me to be hysterical. I did not give him a single ounce of the reaction he was desperately craving. I did not glare at him, and I did not smile. I simply walked over to the wooden bench opposite his side of the hallway and sat down gracefully. I crossed my legs, folded my hands perfectly in my lap, and stared straight ahead at the brass lettering on the courtroom door. My absolute unwavering stillness unnerved him. I could see him shifting uncomfortably in my peripheral vision, his mind racing to figure out why I was not reacting to the collapse of his empire. He did not realize that I had orchestrated the collapse. He did not know that the settlement agreement he was so eager to finalize contained the exact legal language that would hold him entirely responsible for every single federal charge the agents had dropped on his doorstep that morning. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open and the bailiff stepped out, calling our case number in a loud, echoing voice. Richard gently touched my shoulder, a silent signal that it was time. I stood up and smoothed down the skirt of my dress. We walked into the courtroom, the atmosphere immediately shifting to one of absolute suffocating formality. The room was paneled in dark mahogany with the American flag standing tall beside the judge's elevated bench. I took my seat beside Richard at the petitioner's table. Brad practically marched down the aisle, pulling out his chair at the respondent's table with a loud scrape that echoed sharply in the quiet room. He sat down heavily, adjusting his tie and trying to look confident, but the sweat on his brow was gathering faster now. His lawyer, a tired-looking man who clearly had no idea about the massive federal fraud investigation his client was hiding, began organizing his files. Brad leaned over and whispered fiercely to his attorney, pointing at the settlement documents and demanding they get the judge's signature as fast as possible. I kept my eyes fixed on the empty leather chair behind the bench, regulating my breathing. I thought about Lily. I thought about the life I was going to build for her, a life completely free from the toxic, manipulative shadow of a man who viewed her as an inconvenience. I had sacrificed my savings, my credit, and my home to get to this exact moment. But looking across the aisle at the sweating, desperate man who had tried to destroy me, I knew every single sacrifice was worth it. The side door behind the bench opened, and the judge walked into the room. We all stood up. The judge was an older, stern-looking man with sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened the thick file containing our finalized settlement agreement. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, heavy with the weight of impending justice. Brad leaned forward in his chair, practically vibrating with anxious energy, waiting for the judge to hand him the keys to his fake empire. He was marching willingly and eagerly right into the guillotine, completely blind to the blade hanging directly over his head. The judge adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses and began to meticulously review the thick stack of settlement documents. The courtroom was so quiet that the only sound was the heavy ticking of the wooden clock on the wall and the sharp rustle of thick legal paper turning. I watched the judge's eyes scan the pages, moving rapidly at first, then slowing down considerably as he reached the addendums Richard and I had crafted. Brad was practically bouncing his knee under the table. He kept looking at his expensive watch, the one I had paid for, and then glaring up at the judge, clearly irritated that the legal process was taking longer than he wanted. The judge paused for a long time on page 14. This was the exact page containing the comprehensive indemnification clause and the quitclaim deed transferring all property rights directly to Brad. The judge read the paragraph once, then he read it a second time. He slowly lowered the documents to his desk and folded his hands, looking over the top of his glasses directly at the respondent's table. His expression was a complex mixture of professional pity and absolute disgust. Mr. Sullivan, the judge, began, his voice deep and echoing with authority. I have reviewed a lot of divorce settlements in my career, but this particular division of assets is highly irregular. Your counsel has submitted an agreement wherein your wife is completely forfeiting her right to the marital home, the luxury vehicles, and any financial stake in your e-commerce business. Furthermore, she is assuming 0% of the marital debt while you are assuming 100%. Brad nodded eagerly, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the heavy wooden table. Yes, Your Honor, Brad replied smoothly, trying to sound like a seasoned executive closing a corporate merger. That is the agreement we came to during mediation. I am prepared to take on the full burden of the estate. The judge did not look impressed. He picked up the paperwork again, tapping it against the desk. Before I sign this decree and make it legally binding, I need to ensure you fully comprehend the magnitude of what you are agreeing to on the court record, the judge stated firmly. Mr. Sullivan, you are aware that by demanding sole ownership of these limited liability companies and real estate properties, you are assuming 100% of their attached liabilities without any future recourse. This includes all known debts, unknown encumbrances, active liens, and any outstanding federal or state tax obligations. If these assets carry catastrophic debt, you cannot come back to this court next year and ask your ex-wife to pay half. Brad's attorney, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly shifted in his seat. He leaned toward Brad, putting a hand on his forearm. Brad, the lawyer, whispered urgently, just loud enough for the microphone to pick up a murmur. We did not do a full forensic accounting of the business because you waived discovery. Are you absolutely certain there are no hidden liabilities you need to disclose right now? Brad violently yanked his arm away from his lawyer, his face flashing with irritation. Do not interrupt me, Brad hissed under his breath. He turned his attention back to the judge, puffing out his chest and adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit. He completely ignored the urgent warning from his own legal counsel. He was so deeply entrenched in his delusion, so desperate to prove his superiority, that he refused to show even a single ounce of hesitation. Yes, Your Honor, I am completely aware of what I am signing, Brad announced, his voice ringing loudly through the courtroom to ensure everyone in the gallery could hear him. I built this wealth from the ground up. I am the CEO. I understand the intricacies of my companies better than anyone else. My wife simply does not have the financial literacy to manage these types of high-level assets. She is overwhelmed by the responsibility, which is why she is walking away. I am more than capable of managing my own empire and handling whatever operational costs are attached to it. I accept full and total legal responsibility for the businesses and the real estate. I sat perfectly still beside Richard, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I did not react to his insults. I did not defend my financial literacy. I just let him talk. I let him stand in front of a judge, a court reporter, and his own attorney, and explicitly state for the legal record that he was taking total responsibility for the fraudulent empire he had built. He was practically screaming his confession into a microphone. He was so desperate to look like a self-made billionaire that he was voluntarily locking the handcuffs around his own wrists. The judge looked at Brad for a long, heavy moment. He looked at the sheen of cold sweat on Brad's forehead, the nervous twitch in his jaw, and the sheer, unfiltered arrogance radiating from his posture. The judge had been on the bench long enough to recognize a man who was hiding something, but it was not his job to protect a litigant from his own documented greed. Brad was an adult represented by counsel explicitly demanding to take on the liabilities. Very well, the judge said, his tone turning cold and entirely formal. The court reporter will note that the respondent has been explicitly advised of the risks and has verbally accepted the indemnification clause on the record. The judge then turned his gaze toward me. His expression softened significantly. And Mrs. Sullivan, the judge addressed me gently. You understand that by agreeing to this settlement, you are walking away from the physical assets, but you are also receiving full sole legal and physical custody of your daughter. Mr. Sullivan is voluntarily terminating his parental rights and decision-making authority. Yes, Your Honor, I replied, my voice steady and clear. That is my only priority. Brad let out a quiet scoff from his side of the aisle, shaking his head as if my desire to protect my child was some kind of pathetic weakness. He actually believed he was the one getting the better end of the deal. He was trading his own flesh and blood for a house that was already being foreclosed on and a business that was being dismantled by federal agents as we spoke. The judge picked up his heavy black pen. He did not hesitate. He signed the bottom of the first page. Then he flipped to the addendum and signed his name over the indemnification clause. He stamped the heavy court seal on the final page of the decree. The loud, decisive thud of the stamp echoed through the silent courtroom like a gavel striking a block. The marriage is officially dissolved, the judge announced, closing the thick folder. The assets and their corresponding liabilities are now the sole property of the respondent. The petitioner is granted full custody. We are adjourned. Brad instantly jumped up from his chair. A massive, victorious grin stretched across his face. He quickly buttoned his suit jacket, looking like a man who had just won the lottery. He turned to his lawyer and clapped him aggressively on the shoulder. "I told you," Brad boasted loudly, not even waiting to leave the courtroom before celebrating. "I told you she would fold. The empire is officially mine." He turned around to face the gallery, expecting to see Brittany smiling back at him, ready to celebrate their grand victory. He expected her to run down the aisle and throw her arms around him now that the massive estate was legally theirs. But the smile on Brad's face slowly began to falter as he looked toward the back of the room. He realized that the trap he had just so eagerly locked himself into was already springing shut, and the absolute destruction of his life was about to begin. Right as the judge moved to close the heavy legal folder and stepped down from his elevated bench, Richard cleared his throat. The sound was sharp and cut entirely through the quiet courtroom, instantly halting Brad's premature celebration. "Your Honor," Richard called out, keeping his voice deeply respectful, but incredibly firm. "Before the court officially concludes this matter and adjourns for the morning, I have one final piece of mandatory housekeeping. In accordance with the indemnification clause, Your Honor just reviewed and signed, the petitioner is legally required to submit a formal schedule of known liabilities attached to the transferred assets. We wish to enter Exhibit B into the public record right now to ensure there is absolute transparency regarding the specific debts Mr. Sullivan has just legally assumed." The judge paused, settling back into his heavy leather chair. He looked at Richard, then looked over at Brad, who was still standing by his table with a triumphant grin plastered across his face. The judge nodded his approval. "You may proceed, counselor. Submit your exhibit to the court clerk." Richard opened his worn leather briefcase and pulled out 3 thick, neatly bound stacks of paper. He handed one copy to the bailiff to deliver to the judge. Then Richard walked the second copy across the center aisle, dropping it directly onto the respondent's table, right in front of Brad and his attorney. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded like a vault door slamming shut. Brad stared at the stack of documents, his celebratory smile freezing, and then slowly melting away into an expression of profound confusion. He looked at his lawyer, who was already frantically flipping open the cover page. For the benefit of the court record, Richard announced, walking back to his place beside me and folding his hands. "I will briefly summarize the liabilities attached to the assets the respondent has aggressively demanded and successfully acquired today. Let us begin with the marital home." Brad's attorney suddenly let out a sharp, audible gasp. He was staring at the first page of the exhibit as if it had just caught fire in his hands. He pushed his glasses up his nose, his eyes widening in absolute horror. Brad leaned over to look at the paper, his brow furrowing as he tried to comprehend the dense financial tables and the glaring red stamps covering the pages. "The property located on Elm Street is currently in active foreclosure," Richard stated, his voice ringing with devastating absolute clarity. "There is an outstanding primary mortgage alongside 2 fraudulent secondary mortgages taken out against the equity of the home, without my client's knowledge or consent. The property is underwater by exactly $812,000. The bank issued the final notice of default yesterday afternoon. The house belongs entirely to Mr. Sullivan, as does the impending eviction." The oxygen in the courtroom seemed to vanish instantly. Brad stopped breathing. His hands hovered frozen over the wooden table. "Your Honor," Brad's lawyer stammered, jumping to his feet so fast his wooden chair scraped violently against the floor. "My client was not fully apprised of these specific figures. We need to pause these proceedings immediately. Your client explicitly waived his right to formal financial discovery," Richard interrupted smoothly, turning to face the opposing counsel with a look of predatory calm. "And he just spent the last 20 minutes standing in front of this court, under oath, boasting about his intimate knowledge of his financial portfolio and his absolute capability to manage it. He explicitly demanded these physical assets and willingly assumed the liabilities. We are simply providing the receipts for the empire he claims to have built." The judge looked down at the documents provided by the bailiff. His expression turned to absolute stone. He looked back up at Brad, who was suddenly looking incredibly small and deathly pale. "You were warned not 5 minutes ago, Mr. Sullivan," the judge said coldly. "Continue with the disclosures, counselor." Richard nodded respectfully. Moving on to the business assets. The respondent demanded sole ownership of his e-commerce limited liability company. As of 48 hours ago, the Internal Revenue Service officially froze every single bank account associated with that corporate entity. The company is currently under active federal investigation for tax evasion, wire fraud, and failure to remit payroll taxes. The outstanding debt owed to the federal government is $1.8 million. I watched Brad as the massive numbers hit him. $1.8 million. The color drained from his face so entirely that his skin took on a sickly grayish hue. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and finally looked down. The arrogant, wealthy CEO persona he had worn like a shield completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, cornered criminal who had just been handed his own execution warrant. And finally, Richard said, picking up a single sheet of paper from his desk, "We must address the 2 luxury SUVs that the respondent insisted on keeping for his corporate image. Because the business accounts have been frozen by the federal government, the auto loan payments have bounced for the last 6 months. Both vehicles are scheduled for mandatory repossession by the bank. In fact, the tow trucks are scheduled to arrive at the estate at exactly noon today." Richard placed the paper gently back down on the desk. He looked directly at Brad, his eyes cold and victorious. "Enjoy your empire, Mr. Sullivan." The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. The trap had not just sprung shut. It had violently snapped Brad's entire world into pieces. He sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the stack of legal disclosures outlining his complete financial ruin. He had walked into the courtroom believing he was a master manipulator. He believed he had outsmarted me, outsmarted my lawyer, and outsmarted the federal government. He thought forcing me to sign away the assets was the ultimate punishment for my supposed lack of vision. He thought he was leaving me with absolutely nothing. Instead, he had just legally insulated me from the catastrophic fallout of his own massive crimes. By signing the indemnification clause and the quitclaim deed, he had officially severed my name from the impending federal indictments. If the IRS came looking for their stolen money, they would find a court-ordered decree proving that Brad Sullivan and Brad Sullivan alone was financially responsible for the multi-million-dollar debt crater. He had taken the entire burden onto his own shoulders simply because his ego could not handle the thought of sharing anything with me. Brad slowly reached out and picked up the stack of papers with trembling hands. The papers shook violently, betraying the sheer panic coursing through his body. His eyes darted wildly across the pages, reading the foreclosure notices, the IRS, intent to levy, and the repossession orders. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the unstoppable force of a freight train. He was completely broke. He was millions of dollars in debt. He was going to lose the house, the cars, and the business within a matter of days. And because of the federal investigation regarding the forged documents, he was very likely going to federal prison. He had absolutely nothing left. He had even voluntarily signed away his legal rights to his own daughter, just to make sure he could keep the physical assets that were now actively destroying him. The deal of the century had turned into a permanent financial death sentence. Brad's lawyer slowly sat back down in his chair, rubbing his temples in utter, exhausted defeat. He realized his client had lied to him, hidden the massive debts, and walked them both right into an inescapable legal ambush. There was absolutely nothing the lawyer could do to save him now. The papers were signed, the judge had stamped the decree, the marital estate was officially divided, and Brad had won exactly what he asked for. Brad's breathing became ragged and shallow, echoing loudly in the suddenly silent courtroom. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared at the thick stack of financial disclosures resting on his table. I could almost see his mind violently rejecting the reality of his situation, desperately trying to find a loophole that did not exist. Then the shock finally shattered, giving way to pure, unadulterated panic. Brad jumped out of his chair so fast and with such chaotic force that the heavy wooden piece of furniture tipped backward and crashed loudly against the polished floor. He slammed both of his hands flat onto the table, leaning forward with his eyes wide and wild. "This is a setup," he screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched hysteria that completely stripped away his polished executive persona. He pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly across the aisle at me. "She set me up. She knew about the debt, and she tricked me into taking it. Your Honor, you cannot accept this agreement. It is absolute fraud." The judge did not even flinch at the outburst. He looked down at Brad from his elevated bench with an expression of absolute glacial indifference. "Mr. Sullivan, I strongly suggest you lower your voice and control yourself," the judge warned, his tone dangerously low and heavily laced with authority. But Brad was far past the point of rational control. His entire universe was collapsing around him in real time, and the sheer terror of federal prison was staring him right in the face. "Tear it up," Brad demanded, stepping away from his table and moving aggressively toward the center aisle. The court bailiff instantly stepped forward, resting his hand firmly on his utility belt, a silent but unmistakable warning for Brad to stay exactly where he was. "Tear up the decree right now," Brad pleaded, his voice rising to a frantic, desperate pitch. His chest heaved as he frantically gestured between himself and me. "We need to renegotiate. We have to split everything 50-50 like a normal couple. We are legally married. We share assets and we share debts. She owes half of that $2 million. You cannot just let her walk away completely clean while I take the fall. She is my wife. She has to pay her fair share." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the man who had tormented me for years completely unravel in front of a court of law. It was profoundly pathetic. He was begging for the exact equitable split he had aggressively threatened me to avoid just a few days prior. He was begging for fairness after intentionally trying to leave me homeless and destitute. He wanted to drag me down into the sinking ship he had drilled the holes in. "You explicitly waived your right to formal financial discovery, Mr. Sullivan," the judge stated, his voice booming with absolute finality. "And you explicitly stated on the official court record not 10 minutes ago that you were fully aware of your financial portfolio and that you demanded sole responsibility for it. You signed a legally binding indemnification clause of your own free will. This court does not protect arrogant litigants from their own documented greed. The decree is signed and the matter of the marital estate is permanently closed." Brad spun around, looking desperately at his own lawyer for help. But his attorney simply looked away, aggressively packing his files into his briefcase and snapping it shut. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with a client who had lied to him, hidden massive debts, and committed federal crimes. Realizing his own legal counsel had completely abandoned him, Brad turned his frantic, bloodshot gaze back to me. His eyes were wide with a toxic, desperate mixture of fear and malice. "If you do not take half of this debt right now, Audrey, I swear to God I will take Lily." He threatened, his voice dripping with venom, trying to play the absolute last card he thought he had. "I will tie you up in family court for the next 10 years. I will demand full physical custody. I will claim you are an unfit mother, and I will make sure you never see our daughter again until you pay your share of this money." The sheer audacity of his threat echoed through the large room, but this time it did not carry even an ounce of weight. It did not make my heart race. It did not make me flinch. The judge reached out, picked up his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down violently against the sounding block. The sharp, explosive crack sounded like a gunshot, silencing Brad instantly. "You will do no such thing!" the judge roared, leaning over the bench and pointing a stern finger directly at Brad. "You voluntarily surrendered your parental rights in exchange for physical property. You explicitly waived all custody, visitation, and decision-making authority because you stated you did not want the burden of raising your own child. You are legally a stranger to that little girl now. You have absolutely no leverage, no assets, and no standing in this court. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Brad stood frozen in the center of the aisle, the remaining color draining completely from his face. The reality of his absolute powerlessness finally crushed whatever fragile remnants were left of his massive ego. He had no money. He had no home. He had no business. And he had permanently signed away his only child. He was entirely isolated and anchored to a multi-million-dollar federal catastrophe. But the final, most devastating blow of the morning was still yet to come. From the very back of the courtroom gallery, a sudden, sharp sound broke the heavy, suffocating silence. It was the sound of a wooden bench creaking. I turned my head slightly, and Brad slowly turned around to follow my gaze. Brittany was standing up. She had been sitting in the back row the entire time, listening to every single word spoken on the record. She had heard the phrases active foreclosure, federal tax fraud, and criminal investigation. She had heard that the luxury SUVs were scheduled for immediate repossession at noon, and she had heard that her wealthy, successful fiancé was actually carrying $2 million in fraudulent debt. Brittany looked across the courtroom at Brad, and the expression on her young face was not one of sympathy, loyalty, or love. It was a look of absolute, terrified disgust. She looked at him as if he were a sinking stone, and she was desperately trying to cut the rope tied around her ankle. Brad raised a shaking hand toward her. His mouth opened to say her name, to beg her to stay, to promise her that he could fix it. But Brittany did not say a single word. She kept her eyes locked on his face as she slowly reached down to her left hand. She gripped the massive, expensive diamond engagement ring Brad had bought with my stolen savings, the ring she had proudly flaunted just days ago. With a swift, decisive motion, she slid the heavy diamond off her finger. She placed the ring gently on the hard wooden bench, leaving it behind like a piece of contaminated evidence. Then she turned her back to him. She pushed open the heavy double doors of the courtroom and walked out into the brightly lit hallway without a single backward glance. The heavy wooden doors slowly swung shut behind her, the heavy click of the brass latch sealing Brad's fate. Brad was completely destroyed. He let out a strange, breathless gasp, his shoulders collapsing as he stared at the closed doors. He stood entirely alone in the center of the courtroom, a broken, bankrupt man, surrounded by the shattered pieces of the fake empire he had sacrificed everything to build. I looked over at Richard, and we both stood up from our table. The trap had worked flawlessly. It was time to go home. 2 months passed since the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut on my former marriage. The legal system moves notoriously slowly, but the complete and utter destruction of Brad's life happened with breathtaking speed. It was as if the universe had finally grown tired of his arrogance and decided to collect the debt all at once. The federal indictments came down less than a week after our divorce was finalized. His face was plastered across the local business news websites, not as the visionary CEO he always claimed to be, but as a disgraced fraudster facing multiple felony charges for tax evasion, wire fraud, and forgery. The federal agents had frozen every single asset attached to his name. The massive $1.2 million estate he had fought so ruthlessly to steal from me was seized by the bank. The luxury SUVs were repossessed right out of the driveway in broad daylight, while his former neighbors stood on their perfectly manicured lawns and watched. He was entirely bankrupt. But the financial ruin was only the beginning of his punishment. The social and familial collapse was even more devastating. For years, his mother Joanne and the rest of his family had championed his toxic behavior. They had enabled his narcissism, belittled my career, and gladly accepted the lavish gifts and luxury vacations he funded with my money. But loyalty built on stolen wealth is incredibly fragile. When the FBI began knocking on doors in Joanne's affluent neighborhood, asking pointed questions about her involvement in her son's finances, and investigating the source of the funds used to pay for her luxury cruises, her maternal devotion evaporated instantly. To save herself from federal scrutiny and protect her own fragile social standing at the country club, Joanne completely cut him off. She refused to pay for his criminal defense attorney. She refused to let him sleep on her couch. She changed the locks on her doors and essentially pretended she no longer had a son. It was a crisp Saturday morning when the ghost of my past decided to haunt my front porch. I was standing in the kitchen of my new townhome, wearing comfortable sweatpants and a soft, oversized sweater. The house smelled of expensive vanilla coffee and fresh pastries I had picked up from the local bakery. I was pouring myself a cup when the doorbell suddenly rang. I was not expecting any packages, and Naomi and my brother Ryan were scheduled to come over later for a weekend brunch. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. Standing on my welcome mat was a man I barely recognized. It was Brad. He looked absolutely terrible. He was not wearing a $3,000 tailored suit or a $15,000 gold Rolex. He was wearing a wrinkled, faded jacket and a pair of jeans that looked like they had been slept in for a week. His perfectly styled hair was messy and unwashed, and he had a thick, uneven shadow of stubble across his jaw. He was shivering slightly in the morning chill, looking nervously over his shoulder, as if he expected a federal agent to jump out of the bushes and arrest him. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the heavy door open, keeping the chain engaged just in case. I did not say a word. I just stood there holding my warm ceramic coffee mug looking at him. Audrey Brad choked out his voice, cracking with a pathetic, desperate edge. Please. Please just let me come inside for a few minutes. I need to talk to you. I have nowhere else to go. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes, and to my absolute astonishment, tears began to spill down his cheeks. He started crying right there on my porch, his shoulders shaking with heavy, dramatic sobs. It was the performance of a broken man, a man who had finally realized that the world did not actually revolve around him. They took everything, he wept, wrapping his arms around his own torso. The bank took the house. The government took the business accounts. My mother will not even answer my phone calls. Brittany left me the day we walked out of the courtroom. She blocked my number and moved out of state. I am sleeping in a motel that I pay for with day labor cash, Audrey. I am completely ruined. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warm liquid coat my throat. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel angry. I just felt a profound, echoing emptiness when I looked at him. It was Brittany. Brad pleaded, stepping closer to the door, his voice taking on a frantic, begging tone. She manipulated me. She got into my head and made me think I needed all those things. I was under so much pressure with the business and I made some terrible mistakes. But I am still me, Audrey. I am still the man you married. I miss you. I miss Lily. We can fix this. If you could just lend me a little bit of money for a retainer fee, or let me stay in the guest room until I get back on my feet, I swear I will make it right. He was actually asking the woman he had tried to leave homeless to fund his criminal defense. The sheer towering delusion required to stand on my porch and blame a 24-year-old girl for his own forged documents and multi-million-dollar tax fraud was almost impressive. I looked at him, completely stripping my face of any emotion. You signed away your rights to Lily in a court of law. Brad? I said, my voice quiet, flat, and colder than the morning air. You do not get to miss her, and you are not the man I married. You are just a man who got caught. Brad's face crumpled. He reached out, his dirty fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. Audrey, please. He begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic whisper. You are the only person who ever truly cared about me. I have nothing. And whose fault is that? I asked softly. He opened his mouth to make another excuse, to spin another lie, but I did not let him. I did not yell at him. I did not list the things he had stolen from me. I did not gloat about how perfectly my trap had worked. Giving him any emotional reaction would be giving him pieces of my energy that he absolutely did not deserve. You are trespassing on my property, I told him, looking him dead in the eye with utter, chilling indifference. If you ever come to this address again, I will call the police and tell them you are harassing us. Goodbye, Brad. I did not wait for his response. I firmly pushed the heavy door shut, the solid click of the deadbolt echoing loudly in the quiet foyer. I stood by the door for a moment, listening. I heard a muffled sob from the porch, followed by the heavy, defeated sound of his footsteps, slowly walking away down the concrete path. I did not look out the window to watch him leave. He was no longer a part of my reality. He was just a stranger who had knocked on the wrong door. I turned around and walked back down the hallway toward my sunlit living room. The morning sun was pouring through the large glass windows, casting a warm golden glow across the hardwood floors and the comfortable furniture I had purchased with my own protected savings. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had plagued my chest for the last 7 years was completely gone. The air in my home felt light and breathable. Sitting on the soft area rug in the center of the room was my 5-year-old daughter Lily. She was laughing hysterically, throwing a pair of plastic dice across a colorful board game. Sitting opposite her on the floor were Naomi and Ryan. They had let themselves in through the back patio door while I was in the foyer. Ryan was wearing a ridiculous paper crown that Lily had forced him to put on, and Naomi was expertly pretending to lose the game, making exaggerated dramatic sighs every time Lily moved her game piece forward. I stood in the doorway, my hands wrapped around my warm coffee mug, just watching them. My brother caught my eye and gave me a soft, questioning look. I just smiled and nodded, letting him know that the garbage had officially been taken out. I walked over and sat down on the edge of the sofa right next to the game board. Lily abandoned her dice and crawled into my lap, wrapping her small arms tightly around my waist. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. She was safe. She was happy. She had not asked about her father in weeks, completely content with the overwhelming love and attention she received from the people who actually showed up for her. I looked around my beautiful home. My logistics career was thriving, my bank accounts were secure, and my legal ties to the wreckage of Brad's life were entirely severed. I had faced the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and instead of letting it destroy me, I had used his own blinding arrogance to secure my freedom. I had not needed to scream fight or lower myself to his level. I had simply stepped out of the way and let his own momentum carry him right over the edge of the cliff. Sometimes letting the trash take itself out is the greatest victory of all. The best revenge isn't destroying them. It's letting their own greed do the heavy lifting while you protect your peace. Have you ever walked away from a toxic fight only to watch your enemies defeat themselves? How did you handle the aftermath? Share your story in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of taking back your power.